want to say happy Pride, everybody. Very excited to live in a county that celebrates Pride robustly, and I hope that you will all have time to attend a Pride event in Montgomery County this month. I want to first thank Diana. Where's Diana? Dear Diana. And Jill Conway. Diana, my darling. A huge thank you. Diana just got back from being out of town for like, I don't know, 2 weeks. She just rolled in and she did not hesitate to open up her house to all of us, like she always does, for all these organizations and all these important discussions. And we're so grateful for you and your generosity. Thank you so much. We have a bunch of electeds with us today, and if this is in no particular order of any kind of staff, just so you know. And if I skip you, please just raise your hand and tell me. Former County Council Member Hans Kramer, where are you? Okay. County Council Member Kate Stewart. Delegate Vaughn Stewart. Board of Education Member Lynn Harris. Board of Education Member Julie Yang. Jim Michael, Central Committee Member. Former Delegate Karen Brito. Karen, where are you, my dear? Okay. Scott Goldberg, who was the Democratic Central Committee Chair. Delegate Mark Foreman. Let's see, Council Member Natalie Fanny Gonzalez. County Council Member Andrew Friedson. Delegate Sarah Wollick. And then people for others. Oh, and there's people here representing other people. Okay. Yes. All right, my dear Eden. Who would you possibly be representing? Jared Solomon. Yay, Jared. Okay, thank you, Eden, for being here. We also I just want to point out, we've had someone coming all the way from the city of Frederick. Mark Del Campo, who's Director of Strategic Planning there. Thank you for coming. Also, we have from the Governor's Cabinet, we are very honored to have Secretary Montero, who is the Office of Service and Civic and Innovation. And if anybody wants to learn more about this tremendous idea that I think all of us have been thinking was fantastic for years, and this was one of Governor Moore's priorities, so that our students have an opportunity to get paid to do something, get exposure, get experience after they graduate from high school. And so that they can get exposed to the diversity of humanity in service, which is a lot of what we're going to be talking about today around this housing topic. So thank you so much for being here, Secretary. Then I'd like to give a shout out to our board members. If you are a board member, please raise your hand. Thank you to our awesome board members. Reem, Laura, Lynn, Eden, Karen, anybody else back there? Jeff Galster. Wonderful. Thank you all. And then I just want to give a quick shout out to our YCC students. We have Marvin and Sophie and Anna. And Kristen is here, who also did a project, and also Devin. And if the three of you just want to give a quick, they have their presentations out there. So after the panel, I hope that you will go out there. They'll be with their presentations, and you can learn about what they did with their fellowship program this year, which is why you all are here, to raise money for that. So I'm just going to throw this much. Why don't one of you come over here?
On the spot, Jill.
And then just because we want you all to be mentors, we want you all to support this program. So go ahead.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. My name is Sophie Union. I'm a senior at Rockville High School. That's kind of crazy to say. And I'm when they're back there, they're wonderful people. So I started this lobby day. So we kind of worked on the Access to Care project. It would essentially give undocumented immigrants the access to like healthcare insurance. And this is really just important to us because, as we all know, healthcare is a human right. Everyone should have access to it. So what me and Marvin did was that we hosted these 2 lobby days where group members and community members could kind of just lobby their representatives in support of the bill. We also had this like campaign where over 250 students across the Maryland state could kind of sign a postcard in support of the bill. And we're so happy to announce this was passed by Governor Wes Moore. It was signed. Without licensing, we really wouldn't have gotten a chance and opportunities to have mentorship. Shout out to Lynn Harris, my honestly role model. She really helped us throughout the process. We wouldn't have access to any like grant writing resources, fundraising resources. And I feel like this bill wouldn't have been passed without like YCC support and guidance. So yeah, again, thank you so much for being here and listening to our stories.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So your donations today make these fellowships possible. So give and give again. And if you want to become a mentor, please let us know. They also have the information out there for the contact information. Also, I know Will Smith isn't here, but I do want to give a shout out to his sister Carol, who is here. She was here earlier. Here she is. Both our daughters just graduated law school together, so we're very happy. That's where I tagged her to come today. So we're very happy to have her here. Lastly, I just want to thank our sponsors: Carol Brand, Liz Brent, Honorable Karen Brito, Chevy Chase United Methodist Church, Diana Conway, Varuni Dayaratana, and Paul Tiao. Did I mention Paul couldn't be here today? He's in California, but he sends his son Ethan just graduated from college, so. He's in Palo Alto, so congratulations to him. Ethan Durbin, Natalie Fani Gonzalez, Mitty Figueroa, Honorable Andrew Friedson, Patricia Gack, Jeff Galster, and Michelle Russo, Evan Glass, Lynn Harris, Tom Hucker. Tom hasn't shown up yet. He's on his way. I'm sure he's on his way. Will Jawando, Senator Cheryl Kagan, Ambreen Khan, Vic Chopra, Andrea Klein, David Lee, Gabriella Lemus, Honorable George Leventhal, Delegate David Moon, OCA of DC, Hans Reamer, Fran Rothstein, Barry Seltzer, Don and Tina Slater, Will Smith, Jared Solomon, Kate Stewart, Laura Stewart, and Michael Tardif. It's a lot of sponsors, so I really, really appreciate all that. So further ado, thank you all of you. I just want to say I got into this housing issue. I'm sure we all have different reasons that we really care about this in our backgrounds. I'm looking at Natalie, I know you do specifically. And I first did a documentary on homelessness in Wake County, North Carolina in 1988. And that's where I first got to meet people who are unhoused and learn about their circumstances. So I went to work for Habitat for Humanity for a year as a full-time volunteer and met my wonderful and ever-patient husband, David, who was somewhere in the crowd, who was also volunteering down in Americus, Georgia. And we built homes and partnerships with low-income families here in the United States and around the world. And then I found out many years later as PTA president how impacted our students were in our schools by housing, and how our schools that had the highest poverty rates also had the highest mobility rates because the kids were moving in and out of the school during the school year. Talking to the parents, their rents were going up, the places were inhospitable, they had to get closer to where they worked because they didn't have a car, they had to have access to transportation. So it's really important that we connect all of these dots, and that's what we're going to be doing today. It's not just about housing. Housing impacts everything: education, health outcomes, business, the economy, and everything else. So now I'm going to pass it over to my friend Brian, who I've known since he was in high school.
Not that long ago.
Is now a proud teacher at Bethesda-Chevy Chase High School. And he's been a tremendous advocate around housing, so I thought he'd be a great person to give us context for our panel today. So, Brian?
First, let's give it up for Jill. I got coffee with somebody recently and we were joking. You always want to be on Jill's good side and you never want to find out when you're on her bad side. Good ally to have. And seriously, that wasn't that long ago. 7, 8?
Yeah, maybe. You were just
So I'm going to give some context because when it comes to housing, I have more of a personal connection. So I'm going to tell a story and kind of frame everything for us, and just going to set us through how this connects to every single issue, including as a teacher, I have students who have experienced this, either insecurity or being homeless. So there was a 13-year-old student. He went to middle school. He was in a more low-income community, and the rent just kept going up. Rent reached maybe $1,600, and the water bill went up. Couldn't afford it anymore. So we got evicted, right? When I talk about that student was me when I was 13 years old, right? So I am homeless as a 13-year-old. My mom and I, we are, at first we park in a parking lot. We go, well, what are we supposed to do? A friend graciously lets us live with him for a while, but that only lasts about a week or so. My commute from school goes from about 5 minutes to 45 minutes because he lives right up the road. So, needless to say, my schooling experience became a lot worse from there, right? I couldn't be involved in clubs anymore. I couldn't really meet anybody after school. When school ended, our favorite activities were walk around the mall, but we couldn't buy anything. Go to the library and kind of read books. Reading's great, but not every single day of the week for the remainder of the year, right? And that's about it, because the homeless shelter only opened up at about 7 p.m., right? So from about 3 p.m. to 7 p.m., that was my day. Can you imagine a 13-year-old being patient enough to do that? Because I was not, right? So I tell this story because this is what got me involved in everything that I've been involved in, right? I worked through Delegate Stewart on some housing policy, and it seriously was because I realized this was my life growing up, right? And thankfully, my mom was able to pull up together enough money, and we came to this magical land, Montgomery County. And from there, it is not all sunshine and roses, though. I'm really glad we came here, and MCPS has been great. Now I teach for MCPS. But there's a lot of struggle still there. So we get housing, but the housing was in basements, right? And going to be frank, any law enforcement officials don't come after us. They were unlicensed, unregulated basement apartments, frankly, by some slumlord landlords. Okay, they were terrible. There was black mold over most of it, and so my mom started to have a lot of health issues related to that. Right. So when we talk about housing, it's not just homelessness. It's not just being able to afford housing. It's what stock do we have? What options do people actually have when it comes to this? So yeah, we were able to move to Montgomery County, but then we're in a basement apartment that, again, is pretty terrible conditions. And then from there, could we stay in that housing? No, because units come off the market. We have to scramble to find another basement with a landlord who steals your security deposit, right? So I mention all this to frame it and bring it back to my experience as a teacher, which is I had the school year just ended Thursday, thankfully. It's been a very calm, great school year. No news. In seriousness, there was a student, I got an email maybe about 2 months ago, and this was an email, the type of email you get as a teacher where you just kind of can't process it, especially given my experiences. I had a student who had just become homeless. And needless to say, as a formerly homeless person, I look at this email and it is quite devastating. So from then on, I was the nicest possible person to this student because I understood, how am I going to, get a kid to sit in the seat and perfectly remain attentive when they don't have anywhere to go after school? Can you hang out with friends? Maybe at the library, right? Or going somewhere else. But many of the important facets of life just go completely awry, right? I remember one story of mine was back in the day, we didn't have rely too much on the internet back in the day of 2013, by the way. And I would have to go to the library to go on the computer because I was a homeless student. And there was this really funny video. And it was great. It was like, I forgot what it was, but it was kind of dumb. And I started laughing and I couldn't stop laughing. Person next to me was like, "Shut up, kid." So it's those kind of basic experiences where I'm not even really allowed to laugh because I'm going to bother somebody else. Right. And so I frame all of that to say, as an educator, I have homeless students, even at a school like BCC. It is everywhere in Montgomery County. When we talk about what students are defined as being homeless, the McKinney-Vento Act is by far probably the best definition, because it's not just being in a homeless shelter, underhoused, right? Living in kind of the conditions I was talking about, living in motels, which I've done as well. So more students than you would think, even in Montgomery County, are facing that, right? So as we go through with these very lovely people, who, by the way, have higher seats than I do.
Maybe an age thing.
Maybe. Right? But as we go forward, right, they are going to have great ideas on how we can tackle this. But I just wanted to start us off by framing why we're here, the importance of it. And again, even in Montgomery County, people around you may be going through things you would never know, right? A lot of people look at me, I went to a pretty good school, and they're like, cool guy, right? There's no way he's ever experienced that. And then I bring up my story and people are floored, right? So people around you that you would have no idea of knowing are going through a lot, right? So as we talk about this housing issue, there are a lot of people who, if we don't take drastic action, can fall into the same path that I did when I was younger. And so that is why it's important we listen to these amazing folks. And seriously, we have to take drastic action. We have to take it right away.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Richard, for having a wonderful partner for so many years, and he's been a great partner of mine. I've loved working with you for all these years. Chuck has to leave right at 3:30, so I just want to point that out. So we need to get moving.
Love it.
So when he leaves, don't think it's because he's just frustrated or. I also want to point out that Councilmember Kristen Wing just got here as well. And we did have to start a little bit late because I understand there's a huge accident on the Beltway and a lot of people got backed up. But now I'd like to throw this over to my other partner of many years. How many years, Dan? 11 years we've been working together. So my very good friend, Dan Reed. And for the bios of everybody's bios, we're spending time on bios because everybody's done so much. You've got your handouts you can look at. I don't know if we have any more of those. And then we have resources on the back of those, which I'll tell you about at the very end. Okay, Dan, take it away, my dear.
All right, I'm gonna 2 housekeeping notes. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seats up here, and I insist that somebody sit in them. Like right now. Come and sit.
We're not that scary, guys.
No, I'm serious. Come. Number 2, we're gonna do lovely panel with these folks I'm gonna talk to in a second now. But before that, while this is going on, I ask if you have a question to write on one of these index cards, which I'm gonna hand back to Jill.
Yeah, and I pass around with pens.
And we'll do that at the end. So, all right. Thanks for being here this afternoon. My name is Dan Reed. I'm Regional Policy Director at Greater Washington. I lead our housing and transportation work in Maryland and Northern Virginia. I grew up in Montgomery County, and I'm super stoked to be here today. We have an excellent panel for you to talk about some of the solutions that Brian just alluded to. We've got to my right here, Richard Kahlenberg, writer and researcher, Jason Sartori, Director of the Montgomery County Planning Department, Chuck Cook, from the Department of Housing Community Development, and Delegate Vaughn Stewart. All right. So we're going to jump right into these questions. I encourage y'all to jump in and interrupt each other. We're not interrupting, come after just want to say something. And then Chuck will silently leave at 3:30, and if not Q&As by then, we'll do that. All right. So I'll start with you, Rick. So your book Excluded talks about how decades of housing policy has made neighborhoods across the U.S. more segregated. Could you talk a little bit more about what that looks like at the local level?
So, and I'm so glad you opened this up, Brian, because that was terrific in explaining the way that this is a moral issue that's at stake here. In terms of affordability, which is what Brian talked about, it's also a moral issue in terms of segregation. The way we are dispersed by race and by class is not an accident. It's directly related to the zoning laws that decide who gets to live where. Historically, that was, explicitly race-based. So in Baltimore and other parts of the country, there was racial zoning. Black people could not live in predominantly white neighborhoods in places like Baltimore and Louisville. And the sense was that, the justification was that somehow Black people would bring communicable diseases with them, and that they would hurt the property values of white people. So we don't hear so much about communicable diseases. We hear a lot about property values still. So that's that's the origin. When the Supreme Court struck down racial zoning, quickly communities adapted and said, well, if we just prescribe these rules that say, well, you can only live here if you have a single family home, if there's a minimum acreage requirement, if when we allow multifamily housing, there's a requirement that they have expensive brick facades, then we'll accomplish racial and economic segregation the same way. And Montgomery County is no exception to this. I mean, we have the same history of redlining and racially exclusionary covenants, economically exclusionary covenants. And so the fact that we have such stark disparities in our public schools based on race and class is by design.
So you've also done a lot of writing and research about the academic benefits of integrated schools and neighborhoods. What can you tell us about the relationship between schools and housing?
Well, housing policy is school policy. I spent most of my career writing about education issues, and my most recent book is about housing because I kept bumping up against that reality that the zoning laws were resulting in segregation, and if we want to tackle that issue, you had to tackle housing. And I'll just talk very briefly about one particular experiment because it involves Montgomery County, in which a researcher, Heather Schwartz at the Rand Corporation, looked at two interventions in Montgomery County. The first, and when I talk to other audiences, I have to explain where Montgomery County is and why it's interesting. You all know that we are a progressive community that cares about low-income students, and therefore there are two things that were done. The first was Jerry Wiest, when he was superintendent, decided to allocate $2,000 extra per pupil into those areas of the county which he designated accidentally as the red zone, conforming with the old redlining maps in some measure, and so those were the higher poverty schools in the county. The other intervention, which many of you may know about, has existed since the 1970s, is Montgomery County's inclusionary zoning policy, under which a developer, when he or she builds a certain number of units, has to set aside a proportion for low-income families, including very low-income families. And Heather Schwartz at Rand looked at which intervention had a bigger impact. And it turned out that the spending was positive, the extra spending was positive, but that the housing intervention made a much bigger difference. That is to say, low-income students who had a chance to go to economically mixed schools performed far better over time than low-income students who were in concentrated poverty and had extra spending per pupil. So it, it took me a long time, but now that's where I am focused is on housing.
All right, this next question is for Jason. So this week, as some of y'all have seen in the news, the Montgomery County Planning Board just voted to recommend relaxing single-family zoning, which first time I've gotten applause for that. Which, for those who didn't applaud, limits much of the county's residential land to one house per lot. Could you give us more detail about this proposal?
I can.
So yeah, that's very happy. Yeah. So I first, before I jump into that, I do want to acknowledge Lisa Gavoni here, who was
Oh,
our
yeah.
project manager. What? I've said in the past tense, is our project manager, because this is just the first step for this. We have a lot more to go. And I think really it's attainable housing is the first step of the first step, right? There's a lot here that we need to be doing with regard to housing in Montgomery County, and this is just one of the tools we have available to us. But before I get into the details of what the board recommended, I do want to set a little bit of context with some data and some numbers. And so I am a planner, and if any of you had followed any planning board activities, we oftentimes have PowerPoints. I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm trying to do though. So if you look in the back, on the back of your the bio sheet, there is a QR code that will link you to a PDF of this PowerPoint. So I'm going to make reference. Oh, absolutely. So I'm going to make reference to some of the slides that are in there, or just some of the data that are on there. So the first couple of slides are just filled with numbers. And then the following ones, I'm not going to describe what a graph looks like, but you'll see the graphs on there that relate to those same numbers. So the first thing I want to point out is obviously the county is facing a housing shortage. And, you know, we have nearly 1.1 million residents in Montgomery County today, and we're expecting about 200,000 more people to come here within the next 25 years. And our housing production is not keeping pace. So in 2019, our council adopted a housing target for the county of essentially 31,000 new units by 2030. As of the end of 2023, so 4 years through that decade, we have permitted or built 9,535 units, which means we're off our pace. If we were on pace, we'd be at 12,400 right now. And as a result of that and a number of other things, our housing prices are skyrocketing. So, for example, there isn't a single neighborhood in Montgomery County that is affordable to a higher share of residents today than it was 25 years ago. Every single neighborhood is less affordable today than it was 25 years ago. So when you hear people say, oh, I worked hard to get to, you know, buy my, well, people today need to work even harder to be able to afford to live in every single neighborhood in Montgomery. In 2023, the average homes, detached homes sales price was $970,000. In the average, yeah, in the first 4 months of this year, it's gone over $1 million. The average, in contrast, the average sales price for an attached, so a townhouse, essentially attached single family home, was less than half that at $440,000. Yes, some other data, some interesting stuff. Each of the last 3 years, average sales price exceeded the average original list price. To make matters worse, we're seeing record high levels of homes being financed with cash only, 23% in 2023. Meanwhile, only 6% of home sales in 2023 were financed through FHA loans, which are reserved for people with low credit scores. So what does all this mean? We've got homes being sold above list price. We've got homes staying on the market for very short periods of time. We have multiple offers on homes, and we have people competing, trying to get in their first purchase, their first home, but they're competing with people who are coming to the door with cash. It's not surprising that households are with lower credit scores, less savings, no generational wealth, first-time home buyers are having a really difficult time finding some place to purchase or live in Montgomery County. So a few more of the data points on those slides. This is not just a new phenomenon. If you look from 2005 through 2022, we've seen some very interesting population income shifts in the county. The low income population is increased by 88,000 people. That's up to 3 times the poverty level. Our high income households, the population has increased by 67,000. But our middle income population has actually decreased by 26,000 people. Suggestive that we're having a difficult time finding housing for people in that middle income bracket. So what is attainable housing strategies? Essentially, I like to describe it as trying to create more opportunities and options for people to live in all parts of Montgomery County. We had 3 goals. The first was to directly increase opportunities to meet the county's diverse housing needs with a diverse housing supply. The second was to unravel the exclusionary aspects of our single-family zones. And then the last was to create more opportunities for homeownership for more households in more parts of the county. So how exactly did we do that? Well, we haven't done it yet. We're waiting. What we've done is after 3 years of work on this, we have made recommendations from the planning board. We've just sent it yesterday to the county council. On June 24th, we'll be briefing the county council, the PHP committee, the Planning, Housing and Parks Committee, on the board's recommendations. And then we'll work with the PHP committee over in July to come up with, kind of refine it how they'd like to. And then in the fall is when we're hopefully going to see some potential legislation to move this forward, and we'll continue to work with folks at the council. But what does it recommend? Finally get to your question. So we look at this in 3 different scales. So for small scale, we're talking about things like duplexes and triplexes and quadplexes, and allowing those in single family neighborhoods all across Montgomery County. So by right, meaning that you can go directly to DPS, the Department of Permitting Services, and just like you could to build a new single family home. If you tear down your home, you want to build a new single family home, you could do that again now, but you can ask for a duplex or a triplex. And in some places also a quadplex, so 4 units. Part of what the board has recommended is that it be in conformance with a pattern book, which would be kind of an objective form-based set of standards that show you how you can fit a house, a structure with those number of units with parking on site and on particular size lots. Then we have the medium scale. Medium scale is a little bit more focused around our corridors, and this is where you can get some small apartment buildings. And it would be through an optional method of development. Basically, what we're asking in exchange for a promise from the developer that they're going to build units of a particular small size, they get to build a higher density than they would otherwise be allowed. And then the last is our large scale. And this is a little bit more larger apartments. This is a little bit more transformational. This is where, you know, we recently adopted a couple of years ago, the county council adopted throughout Montgomery 2050, our new general plan. It re-envisions the way we treat our corridors as part of our complete communities, more pedestrian oriented. It's got, you know, a denser, more housing. It's got access. They've got access to transit and other modes of transportation. And there we're saying we need to be a little bit more transformational. And so through a master plan process, the application of new zoning, so removing the designation of single family zoning along those corridors and replacing them with something that allows the more dense concentrated developments. Thank you. Okay. So now to bring it to the state level, you may have also heard in the news that Governor Wes Moore signed a package of bills last month intended intended to produce more housing, increase access to housing across Maryland. Chuck, in your last few remaining minutes here, could you tell us about this legislation and why it matters?
Absolutely, and thank you. You guys timed it perfectly, so I don't have to answer any hard questions at all. I love it. Thank you for having me too. As Melissa will tell you, I hardly ever leave Anne Arundel County, so thank you, Montgomery, for having me.
We let him in.
So yeah, you stuck in, right? So we have 3 big bills, the governor's signature package on housing, and they're in 3 buckets. So there's a Community Development Financing Act. There's one that directly deals with renters' rights and stabilization, because we know we have a huge problem with that around the state. And then the last one, which is probably most germane to the discussion here, is what's called the Housing Expansion and Affordability Act, that directly goes at supply, increasing supply.
Could you put the microphone closer?
Yep, absolutely. Is that better? Yeah. So then the last bill, like I said, is the HEAA, Housing Expansion Affordability Act, which directly goes towards supply and specifically towards affordable housing. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that before I go to the other 2. We came in with the vision that we had to somehow address local zoning, right? But in a way that did not make our friends at the local level angry at us, because it is obviously a very fraught issue for local governments. So we work directly with MACO and MML and our friends in county government, municipal government, specifically to come up with ideas on how we can provide what's called density bonuses. If you are hitting certain affordability amounts when you're creating development in specific areas, so it's incredibly targeted where we're talking about, then you would be able to receive a bonus of increased density in that area above and beyond what the base level zoning is, right? So let me try to give you kind of an idea what that looks like. Say you're you have a plot of land and it's here in Montgomery County and it's zoned a maximum number of units to be 100 or whatever piece of size of land that is. If you were to come in and say, I'm a developer, I want to build affordable housing here or a development project, and it is within 3/4 of a mile of transit, and will include at least 15% of the units being affordable, which is 60% AMI or lower, you will get a 30% density bonus. So when Montgomery County says it's only 100 for this area, you get to walk in by right and say, I've hit this criteria, I can now build 130 units, okay? So that is us directly going at how do we create density in specific areas where we want to do it. Most notably, it's 3 specific types of areas. We wanted to go right after transit. Secretary is very much a smart growth guy. He's an architect and a city planner by trade. Urban infill and TOD is what he lives and breathes and wants to do. It's the same reason why LCB and a lot of our environmental organizations love this idea. We want to incentivize that development specifically where it needs to be incentivized. Access to transit and where density is already is greatest, right? The second place where it would be applicable is on formerly state-owned campuses, which are very narrowly defined as existing at least more than 50 years old, previously owned and not currently owned, having at least 2 structures where one of them is in excess of 50 years old. That only affects 10 properties around the state, but it gives us a lot of great opportunity because of where they're located. And then the third is nonprofit owned land. So this guy to my right here put in a bill last session, 2023, the Yes in God's Backyard, YIGBY, right? Saying, hey, churches should have the ability to do that. Then he ran into a little bit of an issue with the OAG saying, hey, this is against the First Amendment, or not against the First Amendment. I would never say delegates serve do anything against the First Amendment. But he said there's a little bit of a separation of church and state issue here. So we took that issue, we stole it from the delegate and said, hey, why don't we just open it up to all 501c3s, nonprofits, churches, everything. And then there is no constitutional issue. And so in that area too, where they own land, you would have the ability to have this density bonus too if you hit those certain affordability requirements. Then the last piece of that is, and the single family piece, and to your point here, around the entire state, it is almost universally not allowed to have manufactured or modular built housing in single family neighborhoods. So the cost of stick built as opposed to the cost of pre-manufactured or modular is significant. So we looked at it and said, is there any way we can just by right allow modular and manufactured housing on single family properties? And that's in this bill as well. It's important to note, people hear that word and they immediately think that we want to throw trailer parks everywhere. And so that's the reason why there's a prohibition in the first place, right? So they do that. And there's an important distinction here is that these have to be permanently affixed to the property. There's no ground rent and then rent on top. This is sold as real property. It's just that the method of construction can be expanded from what it was in stick built. Okay. So that's that bill. And then I'm wrapping it up, I promise you. The Renters' Right and Stabilization Act, another huge one we think is incredibly impactful. It creates an Office of Tenant and Landlord Affairs in the state, which does not exist statewide. So if you're going to call and ask about what problems you're having with rentals, you're having a problem with your landlord, you're calling your local office, maybe in your municipality, maybe in your county. We wanted one-stop shop where we could bring all that information together, providing a bill of rights for tenants that we applied to every single lease that's out there. And then I think what's most impactful and the one that we fought the most with our opposition on was an eviction filing fee. If you want to kick someone out, and you don't actually want to kick them out, what you want to do is you want to scare them into paying their rent. 10 days after their rent's due, you file an eviction on them and you pay $15, right? And then now they're scared and they pay the back rent as soon as they can get it. Plus they owe the $15 back on top of it. So the state had become a de facto collection agency for all the landlords around the state. So what if we raised that amount and we didn't allow them to pass it through? Well, there was much gnashing of teeth, right, in us doing that. And so we did. We raised it to $50, and you can't pass that fee on unless it actually gets to a judge and there's a judgment. All right. You know, then the other part that specifically helps the tenants is we decrease the amount of the security deposit that's allowable to 1 month. So the average Maryland renter was walking in the door and having to come up with $5,400 cash to get in the door, right? That is prohibitive. Let's go back to Brian talking earlier about how hard it was to come up with money to find a house when you're in a homeless situation, right? So if you only have to walk in the door and pay your first month's rent and 1 month security deposit, we just made it a hell of a lot easier for you to do it. So that's the second bill, the Renters' Right to Stabilization Act. And the last piece of that, I'm sorry, I'm not done. Is the right of first refusal, and the first in the nation. This is the first in the nation where you have a right of first refusal, where if you are a landlord and you want to sell your property, you have to offer it to your tenant first, right? The tenant has to have that opportunity to buy it. And then the last one is a very small bill. It's called the Housing and Community Development Financing Act. And that is where we have set up what's called a community development entity. I'm not going to get too far in the weeds, but basically what it means is we want to go out and we want to make sure that the state of Maryland can grab what are called new market tax credits from the Treasury and use that to build community development projects in low-income communities. And so we set that up, and it has 4 cabinet secretaries, the comptroller's on it, and we have 2 members of low-income communities and nonprofits as well. So that's the governor's housing package, and it isn't nearly as we could go into it much deeper, but those are the 3 big ones right there.
So Chuck, could you tell us about some of the inside stuff that made this possible, or do you have to go?
Happy to do that if it wasn't my chair and the chair of the subcommittee that's sitting right here too. No, it was, look, we couldn't have had better partners in the House and the Senate on this bill. In Triple E with Senator Feldman, his leadership with Chair Corman. This guy right here was incredibly helpful in especially the HEAA. He was the subcommittee chair of land use and ethics. Marvin Holmes, Delegate Marvin Holmes, was the subcommittee chair when it came to Renters' Rights and Stabilization Act. As you can imagine, every single bill that goes to the General Assembly is a compromised piece of legislation. I have never seen a bill walk through that has any impact, that actually does something that isn't amended as it goes through. You have 188 of these guys, right? They all have great ideas. They all have ideas. A lot of them have great ideas too. So it was a process. Delegate Stewart can talk a little bit more about that. Plus he's got some other great bills, rental help for families that are facing eviction. But I couldn't have had a better set of partners, at least ENT and Triple E for most of our bills. And we really appreciate it. And I'm not just saying that because he's sitting here next to me. It actually was incredibly helpful to get through the whole process.
Excellent segue. So Delegate Stewart, as chair of, well, first of all, let's give Chuck a round of applause. Thank you for being here today. We should walk on the Bay Bridge this afternoon.
Thank you.
All right. So Delegate Stewart, as a chair of the Land Use and Ethics Subcommittee, you play a key role in advancing housing legislations, which can mean making the case to sometimes skeptical legislators and constituents. Could you sort of walk us through how do you tell the story of why we need more and more equitable housing?
Sure, thanks, and Chuck, I don't know if you're still here, you can hear me. I was just gonna say some nice things before he leaves so that he can relay to the governor that I was nice. I don't know if he's still here, but we'll pretend he is. Well, first of all, actually, in all seriousness, I just want to say, really appreciate the invitation to speak. Really glad to be here and to be with this group. I'm having kind of nostalgic flashbacks here as I sit here and thinking about all the battles that I've waged alongside a lot of people in this room for the better part of the last decade, back when we didn't care as much about the internet. And especially, I've known Dan for a decade and a number of other people. So it's just really gratifying to be here. And if I haven't fought any housing battles with you yet, I guess my largest takeaway here is I would like to. So please come speak to me and let's talk about how we can do more stuff. So to your question, how do I make the case? Well, first of all, on the governor's bills, it was a pretty big lift, especially his sort of zoning and supply bill that has a fancier name, the HEAA or something that I tend to forget. But that was a really big lift, and it was really interesting to be in some of the meetings where a lot of these compromises were discussed. And it was also really interesting to see people sort of tell the governor's office one thing, legislators tell the governor's office one thing about where they stood on the bill, but then come back to me or come back to Chair Corman and tell us a totally different thing. And having to work that out because people, but I think that our biggest advantage was that the governor was behind it. So the nice thing I was going to say while Chuck was still here is that they really did us a huge favor on this because they put this on the front burner. I've been in the General Assembly for now 6 or so years, and I've been doing mostly housing stuff that whole time. And I've been a little bit lonely at times on an island on those issues. And so Governor Moore coming in and really putting this stuff at the top of the agenda and saying that this was going to be the housing session was enormously helpful, not only to get his legislation through, but a number of other bills as well, including ones that I did. So just him prioritizing it was huge because unlike at the county level where a number of people in this room, and I'm not going to start naming names because I'm going to leave people out, but I will name one person who's no longer in office. I saw Hans Reamer here, who's obviously been doing this kind of stuff for a long time. Okay, Hans is still here. Great. Okay, great. Yeah, well, and of course, all the other city council and county council members as well. But, we've been kind of kicking ass in Montgomery County for a long time. At least we may not always feel that way, but at least compared to the rest of the state. And I get to see a lot more as a state legislator of where the other counties are not really doing anything at all. And what the main frustration I had when I came in was the legislature was really not the kinds of concerns that we have to be assuaged at the county level. Like we didn't hear a whole lot of stuff about, oh, I'm worried about like the amount of shade that this bill is going to put on my constituents, or this is going to create too much traffic problems, or just kind of typical what people would describe as NIMBY concerns. They don't really make their way to Annapolis. Those are things that are mostly held, felt in Rockville or Frederick or whatever. But the one thing we did hear a lot of is preemption and about whether the state has a role to play in housing. And so what I was told when I was running for office for the first time in 2018, when I got in 2019, 2020, 2021, the whole time was, well, Vaughn, these are great ideas. Maybe you should consider running for county council so you can do all this great stuff. And there really was not a whole lot of appetite in Annapolis upon the powers that be to step on local zoning and to sort of take back the state's constitutional power to do zoning and land use. There was really no appetite for that. And I think local should be as the entity that's closest to the ground. I don't think that the state should just be coming in and just de facto preempting on every issue. But at the same time, I think when we see a race to the bottom and when we see counties really not doing what they're supposed to build new supply, I think we've seen other states step up. And I think it was about time for Maryland to do so as well. And we couldn't have done that without the governor. And I think that was a big part of the persuasion effort, was just the fact that the governor was involved and said it was okay, signaled to my Democratic colleagues that it was okay to preempt, that was like a cool thing that we were going to do now, I think was probably like 80% of the battle. And then the remaining 20% were legislators essentially who said, oh, like I think my constituents are going to be mad about this. I'm not going to win re-election. And essentially what we had to tell them is, I think what we really tried to bring back to you to finally actually answer your question, Dan, is that we really have to do, I think, what Brian did really eloquently at the beginning, which is to ground this in human realities. Because I think for legislators, their eyes start to gloss over if you give them a QR code. No offense, because I thought it was awesome. If you give them a QR code and tell them to go check out my PowerPoint slides, you're going to lose them. And so what I had to bring it back to for a lot of my colleagues is, yeah, like this woman or this guy, and they always show up at every neighborhood event, and they may be blowing up your email inbox about how this zoning bill or that housing bill or this social housing bill or this rental assistance bill is going to totally ruin their neighborhood and disrupt their quality of life. But those voices aren't the only people that you represent. And in fact, we have a crisis of democracy in this country when it comes to land use, where the loudest voices who are always there are not necessarily representative of everyone in a community. And so what I had to do is essentially put that at every possible waking moment. I tried to kind of take my nerdy kind of glasses and persona off and just really try to level with my colleagues on the subcommittee and the committee whose votes we needed. And we ended up getting every single Democratic vote for these bills, but it was not easy. Yeah. And I had to just basically try to tell stories. So like what I told my staff at the beginning of the session is like, give me anecdotes, like search through every news article, call people you know, ask nonprofit organizations to give us members' names like CASA. We need to just like be like storytellers, just like collect stories as much as possible. So then every opportunity, I would like literally be in these like private meetings with legislators, be like, well, let me tell you about Ernest Skidden, who was in the New York Times article about Montgomery County's HOC housing production fund. And I thought her story was really powerful because she talked about how her lease was not renewed. And she created like all these robust Excel spreadsheets. She was like the model tenant where she kept track of every different apartment complex that could possibly have vacancies. And she called around, she spent hours a day trying to find a new place for her and her two daughters to live, and she couldn't find anywhere. And she was on the verge in 3 days from the lease ending and her having literally nowhere to go. She doesn't have family in the area and she was going to be homeless. And on that day, 3 days before, she got a call that there was a spot open at the Laureate by Shady Grove, which is an HOC property. And it completely saved them from a traumatic situation. And not only did it save them, but it meant that their two daughters, who I think were at the time 5 and 8, could remain in their school district where they already had friends and teachers that they knew. And there are a number of other stories in that article and a number of others that I would tell about, for example, parents whose kids were talking about the intersection of all these issues, kids, who were in special needs programs at certain MCPS schools and who really could not be separated from that without a lot of trauma and agony. And if it weren't for some of these new complexes, whether the private sector or HOC opening up, their lives would have been completely upended. So that was really the biggest tool we had. The biggest two, I would say, is number one, threatening people that the governor is going to be mad at them. That was number one. So that was the part about Chuck. And number two was telling people that, yeah, like this lady or that lady may be blowing up their inbox, but for every this lady or that lady, there are hundreds of other really desperate, vulnerable people who need them to vote for the bill.
Let's transition to some of our audience questions. I got a little stack right here. I got some more. If you have more, come on, bring them up.
Yeah.
Or pass them up,
Mine's gonna be a bit hard to read. So if you wouldn't mind, I'd let you read from myself.
Actually, I got you. Yeah, I can read it. Yeah, but okay. All right. So I will let whoever wants to jump in on this they can. So with the impact of COVID still being felt economically for a good number of businesses in the county, how can the need overall for affordable housing be balanced with the need for housing that allows residents with means to populate areas and contribute to the local economy? Spicy. Okay. How can we balance the need for affordable housing with the need for housing that allows residents with means to contribute to the local economy? I guess we're talking about middle class people, maybe. I don't know.
I'll just say quickly, everyone contributes to the economy. I mean, the big problem is workforce housing. And, it happens here in Montgomery County. It happens all over the country. I had a piece in the Atlantic where I talked about Scarsdale versus a community that was just Fort Chester, just a couple miles away, 7 miles away. And Scarsdale did not allow any multifamily housing virtually. I mean, it was a virtual ban. And people would travel to take care of lawns, take care of kids in Scarsdale, but they couldn't access the public schools, couldn't access, the peripheries of neighborhoods. So I guess I would challenge the idea. It is typical that when a developer wants to build a certain set of housing, that they will, the local community will say, well, will this pay for itself? Will the people who live in that community bring more money in order to cover the services? And I think that's a pretty morally bankrupt way to think about how we treat our fellow citizens.
I would just add, I think that we need to create more opportunities for people who are employed by these businesses to be able to live near where they work. And so, with what we've proposed through attainable housing strategies, but also a number of other things that have taken place that the council's taken the lead on, whether it's funding for the HIF or the faith ZTA that allows, more types of housing on properties of nonprofits and churches. And it's, we need to just create more opportunities for people to live closer to where our centers of activity are.
I would just say that housing scarcity and the lack of housing abundance is something that hits people across the income spectrum. And I think there's good news and bad news about that. The bad news is that the problem is so acute and widespread and deep that we have to approach it with a lot of different solutions. We have to throw the kitchen sink at this problem. there's no silver bullet. And so we have to, for example, as I've tried to do in the legislature, we have to focus on tenant stability and health. And so, I think like Councilmember Meek, for example, who worked with me on a big bill called the Tenant Safety Act this past session, we have to focus on public sector housing, including what the amazing things HOC is doing, which I've already mentioned, which County Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez and Council, are you still the president, Friedson? Yeah, okay, good. I forget when that happens. And others and many others have been champions on the county level. But it also means housing supply in the private sector as well. So that's the downside of that problem is we've got to hit them everywhere. The upside is that it gives us the potential to create a really robust coalition. So bringing this back to the political lens, which is I guess why I'm on the panel, we have to, in order to get this stuff done, to overcome the significant level of opposition that exists on both the county and the state level on a number of these solutions that we in this room may broadly agree with, we have to create a big coalition. And it's not just people that look like me. It's people in labor unions that want more jobs. It's people who care about climate change because we can build dense housing near transit. It's people who care, like the extremely eloquent Rockwell High School student said about undocumented immigrants and making sure that just because we wave flags that say anyone is welcome here, that's bullshit if we don't have housing they can actually afford. So the interconnectedness of this is both a downside. I'm sorry for cursing. I don't know what the rules are.
It's not event.
Oh yeah, okay, good. I have blessings from the host. So, I ask for forgiveness rather than permission. Basically the interconnectedness and the broad nature of this problem is both a downside because we have to do everything all at once, which is the name of the panel, I think. So the extra points for me for bringing that in. But also it's an upside because it gives us the possibility to reach out to people in a variety of different communities at various parts of the income spectrum and bring them into this coalition to fight for change.
I've been upgraded, by the way. Gone up. So just to add on to everything that's been said, because I think it's been said very well. I think one misconception that happens, especially when I bring up the homelessness story, is people kind of have this very stereotypical idea of what a homeless person looks like or what they do or do not contribute. Most of the people I interacted with, again, as a 13-year-old in a homeless shelter, they would go to work right away. So again, people hung around, they waited for the shelter to open, and then they would go to work. And so that many of the times they'd be wearing their uniform, they'd go straight there. So I want to emphasize that many of the people who find themselves homeless are not just, sitting around. People don't want to be homeless, right? And the other thing I want to emphasize is, speaking of middle-class people, I feel like I'm in a pretty middle-class profession as a teacher. And many of my colleagues, I teach at Bethesda-Chevy Chase High School. Some people are coming up from North Frederick. And every single time there's a crash on 270, we get the text in the group chat, hey, can you cover their class? Because they're going to be 30 minutes late to work. So when we talk about people being close to their commutes, or where they actually want to work and grow, that is a really important part of the puzzle. I'm going to put one of my friends on blast. Jackson is from Frederick, and he really wants to live in Montgomery County, but as a middle-class professional, he's finding a lot of difficulty in getting all the costs together. So seriously, when we talk about the kinds of people who want to come to Montgomery County and be productive, we have to think about people like Jackson. He's loving that I'm doing this. And we have to think about teachers, and we have to think about people who are just trying to go to work every single day. So that across the spectrum, those are the kinds of folks that we need to think about. And I'm really glad that you guys are telling those stories. I really appreciate that.
Here's got another one. People will say, I like where I live and I don't want my single family neighborhood to change or to lose what makes it special. How can you ensure that these policy changes will make sure that it won't, impact the county's neighborhoods?
Yeah.
I think that question was for Chuck. The first thing I would say is to whoever would have such a thought, that you're not alone. There are many other people who want to also live in your neighborhood and experience and get that opportunity. And so what we're suggesting that the council take up would provide more people with that opportunity. The other thing, from a very technical perspective, I mentioned that what the board has recommended is that when we're talking about inside existing single family neighborhoods, not the more dense housing that we envision along our corridors, but when we're talking about within neighborhoods, we're saying that it should be in conformance with that pattern book. That pattern book will ensure that the structures have the same massing, the same size, the look and feel of single family homes, except it will be a duplex or a triplex. And so, from that perspective, I'd like to think that having more people and potentially more diverse people in neighborhoods will kind of add to the character and make those neighborhoods more valuable too. So bring it on. That was very well said. And I just want to say, when it comes to the look of housing, if you get bored and you're a nerd like me, you can start looking at some of these duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes. I can't actually tell the difference. An anecdote is when I was canvassing in South Carolina, they had a ton of duplexes and I didn't notice because I would be walking around in these like pretty rural areas, honestly. And there was a duplex there and multiple people were able to live there. I could tell by the mailboxes. That's the only reason I knew. It seemed to be great. And I hope we can get South Carolina's housing crisis pretty soon.
Got a pair of questions here about rent stabilization, which, first off, I want to recognize Delegate Jared Solomon, who was just in my line of sight. There he is.
Yeah.
Got a pair of questions about rent stabilization, which the county passed last year. And sort of the gist of these two questions is how can we have rent stabilization and encourage new housing production? Oh, there's performance.
He's got this. So this is a really great question. Actually, if my whole life wasn't completely dominated by housing before, a few months ago, I actually took a job in my day job, and I now represent tenants as an attorney. So now my entire life is about housing, and rent stabilization is something I think a lot about in both roles. And I think it's a really interesting issue because I think it's actually it's one that divides people that broadly agree that we need more housing. And so I think it can be a little bit of a touchy topic to talk about in settings like this, because I think not everyone necessarily agrees, and that's okay. My personal take is that I think we should lean on the empirics. And I think if you look empirically, there's clearly a number at which you can hold rent steady without impacting housing supply. And I think people are going to disagree on the number, but if you look at all the data and if you look at all the other jurisdictions that have attempted this, clearly there is a number where we are not going to hurt the amount of housing construction we have, but we can also give regular working folks and tenants a little bit more stability in their homes. Now, I think where you draw that line is the difficult job that the county council had recently. And, I think every different county and every different state and every different metro area is probably different on what the right number is to both provide stability without harming too much construction. But what I'll also say is that we can't, in talking about more housing, we can't leave tenants on the sideline, just broadly. And we can't do that morally, and we can't do that as a policy standpoint. But again, we can't do that politically. Because I think if the movement for more abundant housing is seen as something that leaves desperate tenants who are hit by rent increases somehow out in the cold, that's just not a winning political coalition. It's not a good political coalition. It's not a moral one, but it's not a winning one either. So I think that we have to be conscious and look for ways where we can support tenants directly, because I believe in filtering, I believe in supply side economics when it comes to housing, et cetera. But some of that pressure being relieved from the housing market would be years or decades away before the most vulnerable really feel it. So we've got to figure out a way to square that circle, even when it's tough. Now, what I will say on the other spectrum, though, is for any county government, and I guess I'll speak to the county council folks in the room, if we give the development industry signals that are negative to new development, like rent stabilization, it's really, really important for us to give them signals in the opposite direction too. And so I know that the county council and certainly the work of the gentleman to my left is going the other direction, but I think it's important, as the panel again is called, to do everything all at once. And so I think just doing rent stabilization, walking away, calling it a day and patting ourselves on the back is clearly not enough. And I think that was a tremendous achievement that took the work of a lot of people and it took decades to do. And I was right there cheering it on. We've got to do more to balance supply because we can't let the community of people that build houses think that we don't want them to do that.
Just to follow up on that, there are so many things that could be constricting our housing supply that we need to look at. So, it's impact taxes, it's, a lot of the other fees that we have. There's so much more that we need, well, the fact that you actually can't buy our zoning. So I think we do need to take a complete look at how do we stimulate more growth.
Great, we have to wrap up soon, so I have time for exactly one question, which is actually for special guest, Council President Andrew Friesen.
Okay.
Has the Faith CTA, this is one of those, yes, in God's backyard, those we talked about just now, been implemented yet? And what was the motivation behind it?
Oh, because he asked that question?
No, the question is for the council president.
He reads my notes so well. Hi, everybody. Andrew. That's good. So it's still early on in terms of having it been implemented, but really excited about the Faith CTA that Kate Stewart and I put in together. Kate was here, just had to leave. But we're really excited about it. Actually, there's a lot of conversations that are happening right now with many of our faith-based organizations. And the best part about it is that it came from them. It really was their interest in doing this. And I'll just say this, what was the impetus behind it? We had faith-based organizations actually in Kate's district that said, we'd like to do something, but we're not sure what we're going to be able to do. And it's really limiting. And I'll just say, it's not just a generic issue about zoning, which we have lots of generic challenges with zoning. It's specifically related to some of these faith-based institutions because local governments are limited because of the First Amendment to restrict a house of worship. We didn't focus on them at all in zoning and rezoning and master plans. And so what you have actually are dozens and dozens and dozens of faith-based organizations that didn't bother to participate in the master plan process. When the planning department knocked on their door, they just said, it's not really important to us because they could build whatever worship building they want with basically no restrictions at all because we're not able to limit that. It is only now as these organizations who haven't participated in these conversations, who haven't asked like a ordinary property owner would, hey, we'd like to have some flexibility when you rezone. Could you consider this? Could you consider that? Let's think about this. Let's think about that. Now, many of these organizations who, by the way, for the last decade or two have been advocating for affordable housing, have been advocating for all of the values of inclusive communities that have been talked about today, started to say, well, wait a minute, we have this available land. We have a huge parking lot. We have a huge area maybe behind the parking lot. And really, it's not going to its best use to actually fulfill our values. It's only now that they said, well, the last 3 times they did master plans as we've owned this property for multiple generations, we weren't thinking about it, didn't care. And now we want to do it and we can't because the restrictions have left it as single family zoning or the restrictions have left it in a way that nobody wants to actually build it. So we've created a process that makes it much easier to do it. It is not just for faith-based organizations, it's for educational institutions too, but it is largely focused on many of these huge properties of mission-driven organizations, many of whom desperately want to be part of the solution to the challenges that we face, recognize that housing is so key to so many other social determinants of health and of opportunity and of educational access and of job access and of economic mobility. And now we're gonna be able to do it. So I'm thrilled about it. It's exciting. It's just one of many things that we have been doing on the housing front. And I will just, another nod to our state legislators and to the governor. I feel like the state is finally stepping up to where Montgomery County has been going. We were a little, we were leading the country in the 70s and 80s, then we fell asleep a little bit on housing issues through the 90s and early 2000s. The county has been leading again over the last decade and have a lot to catch up for. And the state is now leading the way as a state. So it's really exciting. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, please give it up for our panel, and I'm gonna.
And so thank you so much to Dan. You did a beautiful job. Thank you for your leadership on this panel. Wonderful panel. We are KUA, Communities United Against Hate, Discrimination, Bias, where we can all stand together and make our communities more welcoming for everybody. And so I just want to, in that vein, point out a few of our partners here today. We have Rachel, who is here from a wider circle. We have Jacob, who's on the Board of Action Committee for Montgomery. And then we also have Jane with Montgomery for All. And Jane, you have a little announcement to make, I believe. Do you want to pop up very really quickly?
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, just one thing, you have resources on the sheet along with that wonderful QR code. So look at that.
Thank you so much, Jill. As Jill said, my name is Jane Lyons-Rader. I'm with Montgomery for All. Montgomery for All is the Montgomery County branch of the Coalition for Smarter Growth. It's grassroots led, membership based. I'm on the steering committee. I've got a few other steering committee members here, Mike English, Dan Reed, also on the steering committee, and we advocate around affordable housing and land use reform. So exactly the things that we're talking about here today. And if you were fired up, as I know you all are, about the issues that we've been talking about, then we would love to have you get involved with the advocacy that Montgomery for All is doing. I have a sign-up sheet in true organizer fashion. And we also have fact sheets in this folder that I have here. So I know that after this, probably everyone's going to stand up and walk around. I'm going to put this over on that little side table over there for you to sign up for our email list, and our website is on there as well. We're not the only organization, far from it, that's advocating for these things, but it would be great to have you involved. And thanks for the opportunity. Oh, yes, and sorry. Thank you, Dan. We are hosting a walking tour, a attainable housing walking tour of East Silver Spring next Saturday morning, June 22nd, from 10:30 a.m. to noon. It will be led by the one Dan Reed.
It is at my literal house. Come see my home.
So we would love to see you all there to learn more about that.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. This was wonderful. We have plenty of great blocks, so take your time and meet people you haven't met before you leave. And also, if you could just visit our YCC project over here and see their display and meet our fellows, that would be great. Thank you again so much for coming.
I need students like that.
Yes. Yes.